Hello, geography. I hope you guys had a good break. Welcome back. Today, we're going to look at the Protestant Reformation in a bit more detail and also the Catholic response to it that's referred to as the Counter Reformation. So, this should be a nice way to kind of review some of the last things we talked about before break while also moving on into new stuff and kind of moving towards the end of our look at Christianity. So, we're going to look at three of the major branches or sects of Protestantism, just to kind of see how diverse the branch of Protestantism can really be. Unlike Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, where there aren't really that many sects, Protestantism, there are hundreds of different sects of. So this is just to give you a general idea of some of the diversity within Protestant Christianity. And just kind of an overview of that. While at the end of this, we'll look a bit at the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. So anyway, the first sect of Protestantism that we're going to look at is also the oldest, which is Lutheranism. Lutheranism was founded by Martin Luther in present-day Germany, and Luther was kind of the guy who kicked off the Protestant Reformation in general by posting his list of grievances against the Catholic Church. And Lutheranism is the specific sect that Luther himself founded. See, Lutheranism. See? So Lutheranism is kind of defined by the notion of justification by faith. So as a review, the notion of justification by faith refers to the Lutheran view of salvation. So, according to the principle of justification by faith, salvation comes purely through faith, or purely through accepting Jesus as Savior. Luther, again, argued that faith was all that mattered in terms of going to heaven. Without faith, it did not matter what you did. Luther and the Lutherans were also some of the first to introduce vernacular Bibles and sermons. And as a review, vernacular language is the language that most of the people in a given area speak and use. So Bibles written in the vernacular would be written in languages that most people could read. And in Lutheranism's case, it was German. And the sermons, unlike Catholicism at the time, would be conducted in languages that most people could understand. Again, in this case, it would also be German. And this was in contrast to the Catholic tradition, which held that Bibles and sermons could only be written and conducted in Latin, which most of the people during this time period couldn't read or couldn't understand. And Luther also differed from the Catholic Church and kind of set Lutheranism apart by arguing that believers could interpret the Bible for themselves, that they didn't need a priest or a religious official to tell them what the Bible said. Luther believed that the average person was capable of reading and interpreting the Bible for themselves without the institution of the church telling them what it said. They could figure it out for themselves. Okay. Now, the next kind of big sect of Protestantism we're going to look at is Calvinism. And Calvinism is, again, a fairly broad sect. There are a number of smaller sects and groups of Protestantism that fall under Calvinism. Good examples of that would be Presbyterians or the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They were all Calvinists. So Calvinism was started by John Calvin in Switzerland. And Calvinism's defining characteristic is its belief in predestination. Effectively, Calvinists argued that God has already determined who will be saved and who will not. Pretty much before a person is born, Calvin argued that God determines whether or not that person will go to heaven or go to hell when they die, and that nothing they did during their life would be able to change that. However, Calvinists argued that those who were able to successfully live relatively sin-free or good lives, they were viewed within Calvinist communities as what are known as visible saints. Basically, the interpretation amongst the community was that since this person or these people were able to live relatively sin-free and live good lives, that was a sign that God had chosen them to go to heaven, hence a visible saint. people who had already been predetermined or predestined to be saved. Calvinism is also defined by a very strict moral code. Certain sects take it more seriously than others, but within more the some of the stricter sects, like again Puritans or the Pilgrims, things like bright clothing, card games, and dancing would be banned because they were viewed as either sinful or encouraging people to engage in sinful behavior. So, for example, card games would be banned because they could encourage people to gamble, which was viewed as a sin within Calvinism. However, Calvin also believed that followers could interpret the Bible for themselves. So again, you didn't need the institution of the church. You didn't need a priest or a pastor or a minister to tell you what the Bible said. Calvin believed you could figure it out for yourself, like Martin Luther. Okay. So Anglicanism is the third branch, and honestly, or the third sect, and honestly, I think this might be my favorite one to look at just because it's the most interesting and it's the craziest, just because of the backstory of its founding. Anglicanism is also known as the Church of England. And basically, the Church of England was started by King Henry VIII and later modified by his daughter, Elizabeth I, who were monarchs in England. And the backstory of the Church of England really goes back to, again, Henry VIII and his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So Henry and Catherine were originally Catholics, but Henry was not happy in their marriage. He was becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to have a son. And Henry wanted to divorce Catherine and marry another woman to try and have a son. So that way he could have an heir who would succeed him as king. And since they were Catholic at the time, you had Catholic divorces would have to get approved by the Pope. So Henry went to the Pope or contacted the Pope and asked him if he could get a divorce, and the Pope said no. So Henry's response was to start his own church because he wanted to divorce his wife, and he was tired of the Pope telling him what he could or could not do. And hence the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, was born. So Anglicanism combines certain aspects of Protestantism with certain aspects of Catholicism. So unlike a lot of Protestant sects, Anglicanism has a lot of similarities to Catholicism with a couple Protestant elements thrown in. So, I mean, one, most obviously, the Church of England allows people to get divorced, unlike the Catholic Church at the time. Also, the Anglican Church believes in justification by faith. So, again, going back to Luther, salvation comes purely through faith. However, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, does place a heavier emphasis on the institution of the church and the importance of religious officials. In the case of the Anglican Church, their ministers or priests are known as vicars. The importance of vicars to help people understand and interpret the Bible. So the institution of the church is more important in the Church of England than it is in a lot of other Protestant sects. And even today, there's still a fairly high interweaving of church and state between Anglicanism, or the Church of England, and the English government. Again, the current Queen of England, Elizabeth II, is the current head of the Church of England, and that's generally the pattern that Henry started. The head of the church is the monarch of England, or the British monarch. So, again, kind of an interweaving of church and state there. Now, on to the Counter-Reformation. So, in response to the spread and the appeal of Protestantism, the Catholic Church realized that they had to make some serious changes if they wanted to stop people from converting to Protestantism, and ideally for them, try and get some Protestants to convert back to Catholicism. So there were a number of policies and programs and, objectives that the church instituted during the Counter-Reformation to try and meet this objective. So some of the more positive ones were focused on outreach work. So again, things like community service and missionary work. Probably one of the more notable and more influential and more famous of these efforts was the establishment of the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit Order, by Ignatius of Loyola. So the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, were an order established by the Catholic Church that was meant to focus on conducting a lot of community outreach for the church, particularly focusing on education and missionary work. The Jesuits established a lot of Catholic schools throughout initially Europe, but as, again, Catholicism and colonization and stuff spread throughout the world. And the intention was that they wanted to establish these schools and do a lot of community outreach to try and demonstrate the good works of the Catholic Church and kind of get people to accept the church as an institution that does good things and can provide and can do good things for people and for Catholics who are members of it. And even today, the Jesuit order still kind of runs and oversees a lot of Catholic schools around the world. Most Catholic schools today are affiliated in some degree or in some way with the Jesuits. Okay. Another big was the establishment of the Council of Trent in 1545, which was effectively a Catholic tribunal which was meant to seriously examine the grievances that Martin Luther and the Protestants had with the Catholic Church to determine what things the church would be willing to alter and what things the church believed it was correct on. And there were a number of changes that were implemented as a result of the Council of Trent. Notably, the sale of indulgences was banned. If we remember back before break, the sale of indulgences was the practice within the Catholic Church of saying that followers could skip purgatory, they could skip going to purgatory to atone for their sins before going to heaven if they bought an indulgence. Basically, the church was saying if you bought enough indulgences, you could skip going to purgatory altogether and go to heaven. And the Protestants argued that the church was effectively extorting money from people based on their fears of not going to heaven. So in response to re-examination of this issue in the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church actually kind of agreed that this was not a good practice and banned the sale of indulgences. And the practice of simony was effectively discontinued as well. However, the church did continue its position on salvation, which still serves as one of the main differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. Within Catholicism, the church still argues that salvation comes through faith and good works, which runs counter to the Protestant arguments of justification by faith or predestination. Not all of the Counter-Reformation efforts were quite so positive, however. The Inquisition was also established and reinvigorated to attempt to combat the spread of Protestantism. So the Inquisition had actually been in place long before the Reformation had happened. The Inquisition is the term used to refer to a series or a set of Catholic religious courts that were established during the Middle Ages to prosecute heresy, which heresy refers to a denial or a doubt over an aspect of religion. So effectively, the Inquisition was a set of tribunals established to prosecute those who questioned or criticized the Catholic Church. Hence why, again, being declared a heretic was a pretty big deal and was not something that you really wanted to be called because it opened you up to a whole lot of persecution. The Inquisition really went into overdrive, though, during the Protestant Reformation. Most famous for its phase in Spain, referred to as the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Spanish Inquisition was probably the most extreme and the most violent out of all forms of the Inquisition. But effectively, the Inquisition's purpose was to forcibly convert non-Catholics or prosecute those who were non-Catholics. So typically the way the Inquisition would work in Spain would be when the Inquisitors would come to town, there would be a period of time referred to as the Edict of Grace, which would last for about 30 to 40 days. And during the Edict of Grace, any heretic, anyone who would be found guilty of heresy before the court, or before the Inquisition, was allowed to come before the Inquisitors and confess their heresy. And in return for their confession during this period, they would receive a very slight punishment and be allowed to reconcile with the church. If the Edict of Grace passed, then the Inquisition would enter a period of denunciations. There we go, denunciations, where effectively people could go to the Inquisitors and denounce or accuse others of potential heresy. And these accusations were anonymous, so if you were accused of heresy, you were not informed, you were not told who denounced you as a heretic. And furthermore, you did not need any evidence to denounce somebody as a heretic. You just had to say you expected it or you believed they were a heretic, and then the Inquisitors would bring them before the Inquisition and begin investigating and interrogating whether this person truly was a heretic. And if confession did not take place quickly, torture would commonly be used to coerce confession under strict guidelines established by the church concerning what forms of torture would be allowed, how long torture could be used, and effectively the mindset of torture during the Inquisition was not intended to kill the person, it was intended to make them confess. So the Inquisition kind of put a darker spin on the Catholic Church's attempts to counter the Protestant Reformation, although it's worth noting that in Protestant-controlled areas in Europe as well, notably England, after the establishment of the Church of England, Protestants took similar measures against Catholics. Hence, again, you have the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I being notably anti-Catholic and persecuting Catholics in England after the establishment of the Church of England. So methods similar to the Inquisition were going on both sides, by Catholics against Protestants and also by Protestants against Catholics. So as I hope this mentions, or this has made clear, the Protestant Reformation led to a number of changes within Christianity across the board within the major branches of Christianity. And not all of them went so smoothly. This was not a period of smooth transition, which is, again, usually periods of great religious upheaval or religious change, regardless of their religion, tend to be a bit chaotic and stuff. So anyway, this was my look at the Counter-Reformation. You have some questions over the Reformation that go along with this today as well. And again, we're kind of getting close to the end of our look at Christianity, and we'll be moving into Islam pretty soon.